I've got another transparent watercolor to share with you today. This is a 9 by 12 inch painting of a Blackburnian Warbler on some Twisty Branches. This painting was done on cold press paper, which I seldom use. I decided to give the paper a try and use some soft greens with some blurry branches as a background. I masked off the foreground with liquid frisket, pre-mixed my greens, and pre-wet the paper to get it evenly wet. The wet paper should help the pigments mix on the page and lead to a soft, blurry look. For greens, I used phthalo green in several different mixes. For light green, it had a little bit of lemon yellow and chrome orange added. For the darker greens, cadmium yellow medium and some cadmium red medium got mixed in. For the darkest areas, it had cadmium red medium, dioxazine purple, and ultramarine blue added. Using a number 6 round brush, I dabbed in the various greens, leaving areas behind the bird mostly water to give a bit of vignetting to the warbler. I tilted the paper a bit to mix it on the page. The frisket likes to cause some puddling at the edges, which can leave a shadow if you leave it alone. I sucked some of the extra water off with the dry paintbrush and tissue paper. I dotted in some more areas of green to mix on the page. As the paper starts to dry, the pigments will mix less on the page. I watch the background, and when I see it starting to go from really slick, wet and glossy to more pebbly and matte, but still moist, I know the pigments won't mix as much and will look less blurry if I put them in now. At this point, I started to paint in some areas where the blurry branches will be with the number 2 round brush. Once the basic background was done, I hit it with a hairdryer to lock in the first pass. I like to have a mixture of soft, blurry, and sharp edges in most paintings. At this point, I started glazing in some middle ground areas with sharper edges. I was using some of the same basic pigments, but with a lot more water mixed so they aren't as bold, jotting on some random shapes to suggest leaves without much detail. Your brain fills in a lot of information that isn't actually there and starts to look leafy without a lot of planning. I brought in some more intense greens with phthalo green and lemon yellow lower in the frame. This should really help the oranges on the bird pop later. I strengthened up some of the branches and brought in some burnt sienna into my dark green mix. I also lightly glazed in some other branches low in the frame. On some, I softened the edges as they went in to add some blur. A background like this goes in pretty fast. Painting this portion took about 40 minutes. In general, I wanted to have the bottom more active with twisty branches and the area with the bird more empty. The top part of the painting with the branches was hopefully going to bring your eye down to the rest and provide some fun pathways to investigate. With the basics rendered, I hit it with the hairdryer to lock it in. Afterwards, I removed the frisket, leaving the white of the page. Then I transferred the rest of the sketch using tracing paper and a folding bone. My first job now is getting rid of the foreground white. I used a number 2 round brush for almost all the rest of the painting. For my branches that are behind, I put in glazes of my background greens. This should give a bit of atmospheric perspective blending into the background. On the top layer of branches, I started with a purple, gray, green shadow to quickly build some depth. Once the first pass was on the branches, I used a mix of dioxazine purple, burnt sienna, cadmium red, and ultramarine blue to cover up the parts of the bird that are blackish. For rendering the upper belly and breast, I started by using only lemon yellow as a base color, followed by some chrome orange toward the bill. Eventually, I'll glaze in a variety of oranges and reds on top of those to build up my feather detail. At this point, I started glazing the layers on the branches. The bird will go in quickly, while the mass of twisty branches was going to be the bulk of the remaining detail. I'll often work on the birds later in a painting because they're kind of the dessert. In order to avoid having the orange of the bird as its own little island of color, I decided to push the branches warmer using a lot of chrome orange. This will tie in all the colors. I really wasn't looking at my photo reference much other than the tiny details on the warbler. The general light was pretty overcast with soft shadows. I mostly faked the textures and colors. My basic plan was to use warm highlights for the branches and use blue-purple shadows, both of which were rendered in dozens of glazes. I kept the contrast very low on the background branches, saving the higher contrast for the foreground elements. In rendering the blackish colors of the bird, I avoided using any tube blacks. In fact, almost all the tones on the warbler's blacks were rendered with various purples. The main base was ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and dioxazine purple. In some areas, I'd bring in phthalo blue, phthalo green, and alizarin crimson or cadmium red medium. These had a lot of personality compared to a boring tube black. The cool contrast of the purple with subtle blue and green tones should really make the warmth of the neck pop while still reading a super dark blackish color. For the oranges, I started with lemon yellow and chrome orange and then streaked in glazes of chrome orange, cadmium red medium to build feathery textures and depth. For the darkest areas, I brought in some permanent alizarin crimson and even some dioxazine purple. For the streaky feathers on the breast, I used my purple-gray mixture, first in some glazes with mostly water, and then added more opaque mixes of the same color on top to build darker colors. I got the photo reference for this painting at Point Pelee National Park in Ontario. I typically see Blackburnians high in trees from the underside where that fiery orange throat gives them away. I don't have many photos of the birds down low. We came across one at the tip of Point Pelee foraging for insects in some low branches. I'm guessing this male was exhausted after a long overnight flight over Lake Erie and was fueling up. He cooperated for many photos that were combined into this painting. In designing the painting, I decided to go a bit crazy with all those twisted branches. My reference had a few in there, but I thought I really needed to add some more elements to make it more interesting. Blackburnian warblers are spectacularly beautiful birds and will pretty much steal the show in any composition. Rather than a simple illustration of a bird on a stick with a blurry background, I thought it might be fun to have a whole series of those twisty branches, adding interest and motion throughout the page. I chose to have a transition throughout the painting, with the busiest at the bottom and getting a bit less frantic at the top. I also planned on doing a bit of a vignette around the bird to have it pop a bit more from the background. As I worked on the painting, it really reminded me a lot of the work I do in my day job as a medical illustrator. All those branches reminded me of bronchioles in a lung or blood vessels in a retina. I usually don't have a bird in the central area of a painting, but in this case I thought with all the branches zooming around, it wasn't necessarily problematic. In general, I tend to like to have things off to the side to a degree, balanced by other elements in the composition. I think that if I were to do it again, I'd move them over a bit. After picking away at tons of smaller details, I thought it was finished. I was pretty happy with how this one turned out on the cold pressed paper. I think the slightly rougher surface encouraged me to be a little looser than I might normally be. I had a lot of fun playing around with those twisty branches, and I was really happy with the warm oranges against those purplish black colors on the bird's feathers. Thanks so much for watching this painting of a Blackburnian warbler take shape. I hope you have a chance to paint soon.